Good evening and welcome to the May 24th, 2021 work session of the Mayor and City Council. Tonight we have two discussion topics. They are sort of related to each other, both budgetary. The first one is about the post-employment benefits liability and our strategy for funding it and sending in contributions. And then the second part of our discussion will be on the American Rescue Plan Act overview and other budget updates. Before we start, I just want to note that we do not have a work session next week because of Memorial Day. We will have the next meeting of the Mayor and Council will be on Monday, June 7th. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our new Director of Finance and Administration, Kim Francisco, to lead us in this discussion. Kim.
Thank you, Mayor Ashman. Good evening, Mayor Ashman and members of the council. Tonight's work session on the city's OPEB plan will include a presentation from the city's actuary and allow for a discussion of the plan's funding strategy and contributions. As noted in the item's cover sheet, the city established the OPEB trust in 2007 and began funding that trust aggressively, bringing it up to a funded status of approximately 50% by June 30, 2020, with accumulated assets of 20.6 million. We find ourselves at a point where we should review the funding strategy. A contribution study has been planned for FY22, which will help the city to establish contribution targets to better inform future contributions. Tom Vicente is a senior actuary with Bolton. Tom has over 30 years of experience in delivering comprehensive employee benefit plan consulting, actuarial, and plan administration services to a wide variety of plan sponsors, including governmental entities. He is an innovative consulting leader focused on providing new solutions leading to better outcomes for employers and plan participants. I will let Tom begin the presentation to the council tonight to review the OPEB funding contribution considerations and plans for the contribution study.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. We're going to go through the presentation. Does everybody have a copy of the presentation from the agenda packet?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. So we can start. It's agenda packet page. I don't know why I'm stopping at page 5 here. Bear with me for a second.
Tom, if you want, we have it on the share screen.
Oh, you do have the screen. There you go. Okay, thank you. I was trying to find it myself. Okay, this is the outline of the presentation, and this is all a follow-up to a discussion we had, Bolton, that is, with the committee, the OPEB committee, retirement committee, earlier this month. And the background, as Kim said, is that the pension plan, or not the pension, the OPEB plan, which OPEB stands for Other Employee Benefits, meaning the benefit program for retiree medical benefits for your staff, has been around for a long time. And you began funding it several years ago when the various accounting rules changed and you had to start putting different measurements of the liability for this promise of future benefits on your books. We go to the next page in the packet, please. Thank you. So this is in history. Been following the accounting rules since 2008. Really, in a very short period of time, have grown the trust fund quite dramatically, up to about almost $27 million as of the end of March. So it grew very quickly. You've been putting contributions in on a regular basis. And you've had some very good investment performance. If you turn to the next page in the packet, please. And I should say, as we get going, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask while we're there. Well, there'll be time at the end, of course, but if you have a question on a particular slide, just interrupt. This slide just gives you some of the history. So a lot of numbers on this page. Probably the key numbers to look at are the bottom line, which says funded percentage. So that shows you how the plan has gotten better funded over the last 5 years. So as of June 30, 2020, the plan was just about 50% funded, 49.76% funded, which is up, again, as I mentioned, dramatically from where it was just 5 years ago, when it was only 14% funded. One thing to notice on this page if you look to the line second up from the bottom, where it says EOY liability, EOY stands for end of year, meaning the June 30. You'll see as of June 30, 2020, that was $41.4 million in liability. That's the value, the economic value of the promise to pay those medical benefits or the subsidy for the medical benefits that the city has promised its current employees and its current retirees. And the interesting thing, when you look at this, you see that number has gone up and down over the course of the last 5 years, as high as almost $56 million 5 years ago, dropping down to just under 40 million, up to 43, and then down to 41. And that's a topic we're going to cover on the next slide. If we can move to the next slide, please. This just sort of summarizes what we were doing, what we just talked about. And the reason that this has come up now, why this is being brought to the City Council, is because the plan has gotten now close to 50% funded. The thought was to really make sure that there's a good, rational approach, well thought out approach to continuing to fund the plan. And to make sure that we're following an approach that fits within the budget parameters of the city and can be managed over time and make sure you get to a good place. Now that we're getting better funded, we're going to make sure that we don't overfund the plan. As strange as that might have seemed just several years ago, we were down in the teens. Now that we're 50% funded, it could actually happen. Next slide, please. So just covering some background on funding policies here. So the CCA, for those who aren't actuaries in the room, is the Conference of Consulting Actuaries. So they're one of the professional societies, and a white paper was published a number of years ago talking about how to fund pension plans and putting out a lot of different concepts to be used. And a lot of those concepts follow for OPEB plans as well, because pension plans and OPEBs are both promises to make payments in the future. However, there's some real differences between OPEB and pension plans. But some of the things that are true, even with OPEB funding, are the same as the pension objectives. You want to have sufficient assets to pay benefits. You want to try to minimize the volatility of your contributions and minimize the impact on the budget. You want it to be transparent. You want to be able to be sure you can explain to the stakeholders why you're putting in what you're putting in and how you got there. And of course, there's going to be some tension between volatility and some of the other aspects here. So this is some of the backgrounds on the basis for funding policies. Go to the next slide, please. As we mentioned, with the OPEB plan, we want to make sure we ensure the adequacy, but we also want to make sure we have a level allocation of costs. And that is the idea that when you hire someone and they're going to receive this benefit 30, 40 years from now, you really want to allocate their costs and pay for the benefit during the time in which they're providing services to the city. So that way current taxpayers are paying for the benefits that the individual is earning while they're providing those services to the taxpayers, and not having taxpayers 2 generations from now paying for the benefits for someone who has long since retired. And there's a balance there between stable contributions and the accountability of the contributions. Next slide, please. Okay, so then we get into really the meat of today's discussion, which is that pension and OPEB plans do have some real differences between them. And one of those is that OPEB benefits are more uncertain than pension benefits. So a lot of the pension rules talk about funding the plan to 100% funded. And that's easier to say when you know you're going to pay out a certain dollar amount to somebody. But with an OPEB plan that's primarily medical, you know that medical plans, the costs fluctuate sometimes. And you'll go through periods where medical plan costs rise very quickly, and other times where they're very stable or even declining a little bit. And so they're just not as certain. In addition, part of the OPEB benefits cover individuals who are covered by Medicare. And so the OPEB plan becomes secondary to Medicare. So as the federal government changes the Medicare rules, the OPEB plan costs change. Probably the most recent big change there was when George Bush was president and they expanded Medicare to pay for some of the prescription drug benefits that were out there. That was a big reduction in cost for OPEB plans. So OPEB plans are more flexible. They can generally be reduced. You can make changes to the medical plan, move from an HMO to a PPO to all these different types of medical programs. And that could all have impacts on the costs. All that's a long-winded way of saying OPEB plans are not as certain in terms of the benefits that people are going to receive or the cost of those benefits as a pension would be. So that's why we need to make some distinctions in the funding policy. Thank you. Okay, so a lot of words on this page, and following up on what I said about the distinctions, while pension plans you might want to fund to 100%, an OPEB plan you generally don't want to fund to 100%, because if you do and you have one of these fluctuations, you could find yourself as having overfunded the plan, and now you have money that you could have used for something else for the city that has now been locked up in this OPEB trust. So generally, we recommend a lower funded target than 100%. Not dramatically lower. We're not saying, fund to 30%, but not 100% either. And then the factors, and this gets to the crux of the conversation and the study we're going to do in a few months, the factors to consider are how conservative are the assumptions going to be we use to determine where you want to end up. And that goes a lot, when we talk about the assumptions here, the big assumption is what kind of investment return can we project into these long-term projections? How certain is the benefit design, and what are the other government needs? Because what we'll do is we'll come up with a range of possible funding approaches, and they'll be, some will be more aggressive, some will be more conservative, and they're not right or wrong. It's just that there's a range. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so as we mentioned, I think was covered in the initial write-up, in a meeting earlier this month, there was a discussion of doing a study to develop just such a policy. And the way we're proposing to do this is we're going to include in the study a projection of future hires. So we're not going to say that the current group just stays and there's nobody ever hired in the future. We're going to roll in the people who are hired tomorrow and next year and the year after that and so forth. We want to set a realistic long-term rate of investment return. And then the contribution target needs to be set. We would suggest between 70 and 90% funded as the target, because we think that gives you enough, you built up a large enough body of assets that you've largely paid for, you've paid for all the benefits of the current retirees and paid for most of the benefits of those who are currently working. So you're not running a big deficit that would affect a future generation of taxpayers, but yet you don't have much of a worry about overfunding the plan. The fourth bullet, set a target date. When do you want to reach this 70 or 90% funded? Is it 15 years from now? Is it 20 years from now? Is it 30 years from now? We also generally assume that we want to have a contribution policy that says the contributions will increase with the economy. So if we're going to say the economy is going to grow at a 2.5% or 3% rate, that's what we would set the contributions to the trust to grow. So relatively smaller today in nominal terms, but growing in the future, presumably as the city can afford higher contributions as the economy continues to grow. And then the next bullet there is an example. So an example policy might be, we want to fund to 80%, reach of 80% target 30 years from now, assuming that we get a 6% rate of investment return on the trust. So that would be an example of one of the answers we might get out of the study. And what we would do in the study is figure out sort of a range for you with different investment returns, different targets, different periods of time to get there. What does that mean from a budgeted contribution standpoint? And then within a range that you feel comfortable, because some councils will say, I don't want to put this out over 30 years. That's too long. Let's make it 25 years, or let's make it no more than 20 years, or whatever it might be. There may be some specific opinions on investment return rates, 6% or 7%, what might be there. And again, you're talking about long term. And using those, we can come up with a range of different numbers. So you have an idea about what it means to the budget. And that's the crux of what the study would do. Go to the next slide, please. This is the schedule. So it doesn't really, we weren't talking about starting the study until later this year. primarily because that's when we get new census information. We get the census information on a calendar year basis. And so there's some other things that are going on now with the plan as far as setting some asset allocation approaches, that those need to be finished up in advance of us starting this study. So the idea was that get those things finished, get those settled, and then we can start this study up so that when we get to this time next year, the study will be completed and you'll be able to implement the policy going forward. So I believe that was everything in the presentation. Let me stop talking and turn it over to you all for any questions or comments.
I think there actually was one more slide.
Oh, was there? Okay.
One more sort of concluding slide. Staff,
Oh, you're right, there was.
Bring up page 15.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
There you go. And the conclusion is no right answer. So as an actuary, it really pains me to say there's no right answer, but there is no right answer. You know, cities do, and towns and counties do different things based on what is right for them. There's a range, and we'll help guide you to that range. Like I said, we don't recommend saying our target should be 50%. But you know, as low as 70%, some organizations use that. Others say, no, I want to be much closer to 90%. And the nice thing about this is it becomes very transparent. It makes the budgeting process easier, and gives you some real concrete, a real concrete goal that you can put out there and say, we have a target date. We know what we're expecting. We know how we're going to handle when things go up or down. Because one thing that we know will happen when we start this program is it'll look nice on paper. Then the very first year, something very strange will happen. The stock market will tank, or the stock market will go way up, and we'll either be ahead or behind. And then the process will automatically adjust. And that's part of the mechanism we want to build into it. Now I think that's the end of the slide. So I apologize for that. But certainly, again, any comments or questions or discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So actually, my first question is for Tanisha and Kim, and that is for the purpose of tonight. I'm assuming this is just what we're receiving now is just sort of an update, and you're not looking for specific guidance. We're moving forward with this sort of analysis of our policies, and our decision points will be later as laid out in the earlier slide. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Sorry, I was looking to see if Kim was going to respond. She was probably looking to see if I was going to.
Right.
Yes, that's correct. We are not asking for any decisions tonight. I thought the information, and actually first let me say thanks to Tom Vicente for stepping in. I know that our original presenter, our consultant that we regularly work with, fell ill and wasn't able to join us, and he stepped in today. And so we appreciate you being here with us tonight. So there were a few pieces of information being new to the city that I hope you all picked up on as we wrestle with this question of, is our current contribution level adequate? And I say adequate because I think there's differing opinions about whether it's enough or too much or too little. And part of what we want to embark on this study, part of our goal there is to try and determine what's right for us. And so as you heard Tom say, there is no right answer. There's no recommendation. There's no rule of thumb, if you will. But there are some helpful pieces that'll come out of the study that will help us craft a plan, a policy for us. I think the interesting pieces for me was also understanding where we were just a few short years ago. And the ground we've covered in that time, some with our contributions, some with a lot of help from the market, which is something that needs to be considered as well. So we hope this information was helpful in providing some baseline level of understanding of what we're doing and why we're doing it now. And that, this is a good time. And so we thank Councilmember Sesma and Harris for their questions, because it is a good time to review and undertake this study and determine, what our next level of the journey looks like.
Thanks, Tanisha. So one more question, and this is sort of Tom, you may be able to answer this, or Kim. In terms of what are the portfolio of investments are, or what the portfolio is of how these investments are allocated. You know, I see one of the decision points is sort of an assumption about what our return is going to be on this investment. And I would have thought, I came into this sort of thinking, well, you know, these have to be very conservative investments that, you know, mostly bonds. Bond yields are at such a ridiculously low level these days that to look at 6% is to say, you know, we're looking at 3 or 4 times what a bond would yield. So am I to understand we really, like, some of these assets are invested in equities? Is that the case here?
Well, right now, that's a great question. Right now, we are actually going through an asset allocation study as well. So we will be looking at developing a more detailed investment policy for the OPEB trust, and that will include a mix of investments. We are legally restricted from investing general operating cash in certain types of investments, but it is not as strict when it comes to retirement and OPEB type trusts. So those investments can be invested a little more aggressively, but of course, we don't want to get too aggressive and then find ourselves, you know, taking on unnecessary risk. So right now there is an asset investment allocation study that's happening, and the outcomes of that will help inform that projected return that Bolton will use for the contribution study.
Cool.
And Mayor, I can give you the breakdown of our current. We didn't bring the portfolio information with us because we were just focused on sort of the actuarial side of the equation. So the investment lineup, I believe we are in. It's sort of a level between low and moderate risk, and it's a portfolio of various assets. So if you think about being on that side of the spectrum, right, we're not talking about a ton of aggressive instruments, but there are a few in there that work in the mix. So we do want to evaluate whether we're in the right level of risk, and whether we've got the right structure for the portfolio. We're working with currently ICMARC, which is becoming Mission Square, to do that evaluation as well. So more to come there.
Great. I'm sure that's worked to the benefit in the last couple of years of the trust fund. So any other questions or comments? We'll go with Ryan and then Neil and then Lorianne. Ryan, go ahead first.
Thanks, Mayor. I actually had some of those same questions about the investment mix. And again, I know that wasn't exactly on the agenda of the presentation tonight, but I'm glad you brought those up. So just to follow up on that, does ICMARC, are they the entity that is the portfolio manager of those investments, or is there a separate entity that we contract with to actually do the management of the portfolio investments?
We have an investment advisor, but the city is managing the funds.
Okay,
got it. I understand it.
Okay, thanks. And then I don't know if you all have these numbers handy, so apologize for putting you on the spot. And if you don't have them, that's fine. But going back to one of those early slides that showed the breakdown of the EOY assets and liabilities, I realize, as has been said repeatedly tonight, that there are a lot of unpredictable factors that change from year to year. But I was curious if you all could tell us what the draw on the fund has been on an annual level over the last few years within a range. In other words, what the annual individual annual liability is as opposed to the overall actuarial liability for all employees and former employees. Do you guys have those numbers available? Like, is it costing us $3 million a year, $5 million a year? Obviously, it will vary from year to year.
Yeah, so yes, so it does vary year to year. The last 2 years, the dollar commitment from the trust or from the plan to pay for retiree medical benefits for current retirees was about $1 million a year. So as there's more retirees, of course, it gets more expensive, but that's the pay-as-you-go cost, so to speak. That's what's coming out of the trust to pay for the benefits, the subsidies that you promised to current retirees.
Sure. And again, I understand there's no guarantee it stays at $1 million a year, but I just wanted to help us all get a sense. I mean, we're looking, over the long term about the total assets and liabilities. I wanted to sort of get a sense on a year-over-year basis what this kind of means. The other question I had is there ever a point at which a trust like this can sort of become self-sustaining if the rate of return and the corpus kind of, get to a point where they're sort of matching the year-over-year out-of-pocket cost, and we kind of can let it go on autopilot? Or is that not really something that happens? It's really, we just have to manage this sort of in perpetuity in terms of making, regular decisions about what our targets are going to be and updating and modifying those decisions.
Well, I think the goal would be to set the target once, and then you're working toward the target. If you're going to have a target that's less than 100% funded, then you're always going to have a cash commitment for an annual cash commitment for the new people. So you hire a new person, you've saved no money for their retiree medical benefits. So then you would have a cash commitment to fund them as they go forward. So there's always something that's going to be paid. So the idea with some programs would be that if you got to your point, if you said, let's get this funded to 120% of our liabilities, and then if we get a 5% or 6% return on that extra 20%, that'll fund any new employees forever. That could happen, but you'd have to have that much higher target because you'd have to build in a surplus,
right, so
that you are paying in advance for the employees. And there's been plans in the past that's happened. Usually when you have a several year large investment return on the fund, so you might be at 80-90% funded, then you have a 25% return on your funds 2 years in a row, and all of a sudden you're at this very high funded ratio. That's how that would happen, but that's generally not the target. So it can be. I mean, some say I want to get to a point where I'm not paying for it, but in theory, as long as you're always having new employees come in, eventually those new employees would draw down from the trust enough money that you have to fund it again.
Okay, understood.
And to your point, Tom, I think that if there was a decision made at some point to close the plan to new entrants or to significantly reduce the benefit extended to new plan entrants, then perhaps the plan could run on its own, at least for a while, in theory, but it would also be very market dependent as well.
Okay. All that makes sense to me. And then the other question I had was just a technical question about accounting rules. I know that you said that there's no official actuarial guidance on targets. I know for certain types of benefit accounts, there's a floor, a sort of a minimum that the accounting rules require in terms of what's being contributed either annually or what the balance is at any given time. Are there any accounting rules that apply to the OPEB trust in terms of minimums that we have to maintain separate and apart from actuarial guidance as to targets?
Yeah,
there are no accounting rules.
Okay.
There's just, I think what you might be referring to, Councilmember Spiegel, is the actuarially determined contribution, which isn't really accounting. It really is very actuarial. And so once we're able to set that policy target, then our actuaries can determine what that minimum contribution would be so that we're able to meet that target by the prescribed date, taking all other things into account. So it's not, it really isn't an actuarial thing. Tom can probably speak to that more.
Yeah, sure, certainly. You're absolutely right, Kim. And even the actual contribution, it's not a legal requirement in any way. But what it is you would be disclosing on your balance sheet and your financial statements every year that you had an actuarial contribution of X and you made Y. And in theory, if Y was less than X, if you weren't making the full actuarial contribution, somebody examining your financial statements might say, "Oh, why is this city not able to make their commitment? They made a commitment and they're not doing it. Is that something we should be concerned about as a creditor, for example?" But there's plenty of organizations out there who do not fund their retiree medical programs, largely because they don't have the financial resources to put the extra money in. Generally, the credit rating agencies take a positive view of funding the retiree medical. It helps your credit rating and so forth. But right, there's no legal floor.
Sure. No, I understand the difference with the ADC. I just wasn't sure if there was something else out there. So I appreciate that clarification. Those are all the questions I had. Thanks.
All right, we'll go to Neil.
So I just have one question that we'll probably find out about as you go through the process in a year or so, but I'd like to know now how, just for my own edification, how it works. So because there's variability in the market returns on the assets that are already put aside. So just doing some simple arithmetic, we have $20 million more or less already in assets. We need $1 million a year just to cover the current retiree medical benefit cost. We want to put another X, let's call it another $1 million in to increase the base that we have. So if that's the plan, or whatever that number turns out to be, how do you deal on an ongoing basis with the variability of market returns? If it goes up, do you put less? If it goes down, do you put more? Or is there some way to smooth that process out so you're putting the same amount every year for some reasonable period of time, and then the market goes up and down and it averages out over time?
Right. So the way it often works, and there's variations around there. So we're going to come up with a number. We're going to say you're going to make, as I said, it's going to go up a certain percentage every year. So let's make the numbers nice and easy. If it's $1 million the first year, and you're going to add 3% to that, that's going to put you at $1,030,000 a year, the second year, and so forth, going up every year. And then what's going to happen, as you said, is that you're going to have some sort of market forces. Maybe medical plans will get more or less expensive, or the investments will do better or worse. And essentially what you do is you look at the difference between where you expected to be and where you actually are. And there's a gap, either a positive or negative gap. And then you're going to, generally speaking, you're going to say, we're going to build that difference into the future contributions over a period of time, usually a 15-year or so, 15 or 20-year period of time. So you would essentially amortize that in to the contribution. So there would be a slight change upward or downward in the contribution on a year-to-year basis. And the idea would be to use different approaches that would allow you to, from an investment side, allow you to smooth out the market cycles. Since the market tends to go up and down in 4 or 5 year cycles, you would do something to avoid having big increases or decreases when you hit the peaks or the troughs of those cycles, and average them out. But again, you would spread it over a 15 or 20 year period so that it was a relatively small impact, and a rolling 15 or 20 years. So it's not all coming to an end at one point in time, like a bullet loan or something like that. It would all be spread out over a uniform time and gradually phased in.
All right, that is very reassuring, because that long, 15 or 20 years time horizon for smoothing it out will really take care of the bumps in the road and make it possible for us to budget a relatively steady amount going forward, which is very helpful in making our plan. So thank you.
We'll go to Lorianne.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you again, Tom, for the presentation. I know questions about the portfolio, the specifics about our investments isn't on the agenda tonight, but since we will be exploring the investments, the portfolio, and how best to reinvest this money and how much to invest it to, will we be looking at the specific mix of investments? Like, do we know if we're investing in clean energy or?
That's certainly something we can take a look at when we talk with our investment advisor about this process when we get to that point.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know exactly what our money is being invested in, what stocks and whatnot. So, okay, that was all I had. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Mike.
Okay, thanks, Tom and Kim, for the presentation. Very informative. So what's the typical municipal funding level or liability? If we always compare ourselves to other municipals. I'm just curious. We're a city that has no debt, basically. So, but this is in a way, this is debt we're amortizing over a period of time. So I was just wondering if there is a kind of an average level which would represent a target that other municipalities set in terms of the level of liability they maintain or the level of funding that they maintain.
Yeah, it really, so certainly there's an average out there. You can always find an average, but I think when you look around the country, for example, there's plenty of jurisdictions out there. I think New Jersey's one, New York's another, where even if they set up a trust as you have, they can't invest in anything other than essentially cash-like investments. They're prohibited by their state constitution from doing anything. So those jurisdictions essentially don't fund, because it would just be putting cash aside and essentially sitting it under the mattress. In areas where there is funding allowed, where they're allowed to invest in more marketable securities, whether it be bonds or equities or whatever they might be, you do tend to see a lot more funding on this. I think in terms of what we see in the areas where you can have funding, at this point being between 50 and 60% funded would put you in the upper half. The halfway point's probably around 40-45% in terms of how well funded programs are. Some started very slowly, some had extra funds. Again, the financial status of the organization before they started funding has a lot to do with that. I knew a city once who they told me they were going to start funding, and they were thinking about $10,000 or $15,000 a year. When I told them it was $1 million a year was sort of the run rate, they just kind of looked at me and laughed just like that. And so that was really different from what they could afford or what they conceived of. But especially in Maryland, we do see a lot of the counties and a lot of the cities funding. And again, probably that 45-50% funded is about sort of the median, with certainly plenty down at 20% and some others who got ahead of the game and got up to 60 or 70% funded a little faster. Usually they started earlier, even than the GASB rules prompted others to fund, and that's how they got that much higher up. So you're right in the mix, not on the bottom end, just probably a little below median.
Okay. So this is, it is a post-employment benefit that we're talking about, but in basically the process, we started this in 2007, 2008. We had a very different workforce at that point. We had an older workforce with long years of service in the decades. You could count 2 to 3 decades on average across the board. I think that's changed quite a bit. We have a younger workforce. We have more turnover. We have fewer years of service. How does that affect the liability going forward? with the understanding that I think that the workplace has changed. People don't stay in the same, don't stay with the same employer for the same period of time. They move, they're looking for promotions, et cetera. So just how does that affect the average age and years of service in the workforce affect this and the growth of the trust or the liability?
So what we do when we calculate that liability, we're looking at each individual who's currently either retired or working at the city today and projecting out what we expect to happen with them. So for those who are currently retired, we're projecting out how long are they going to live and what's the trajectory of the future medical costs going to be. For the ones who are currently working today, we're doing both of those things. How long are they going to live and what's the trajectory of future medical costs? We're also building in what's the likelihood that they're going to stick around to ever get this benefit? And if they do, how old will they be when they retire? So we factor those in and we refresh those assumptions on a periodic basis so that we're not treating the workforce of 2021 as if they're behaving the same way as the workforce from 1980 did. So about every 4 to 5 years, we more or so if we see market changes, but on a regular basis, at least every 4 to 5 years, we sit down, we get the census, we look at what happened over the last 4 to 5 years, what were the trends, and then we adjust those assumptions. And you're right, in some cases you see, turnover was higher. People aren't staying longer. So that is adjusted as far as a future expectation, and your costs would go down. Similarly, if people are retiring later, so those who stay, they can't get Social Security until they're age 67, for example. So they're staying until age 67 instead of retiring at age 62. That also has an effective cost. You're paying no pre-Medicare years, which are the more expensive years in that case, and fewer years altogether because they're working later. Other times you see the opposite happening. People retiring earlier or people staying longer, and then you have the opposite effects. But I'm being long-winded. We review the data and we review it every 4 to 5 years to say what's been happening, what's the trend, let's update our assumptions about those trends.
Okay. And I guess the last one is, this one's really kind of in the city manager's wheelhouse here. Is it when, in your experience, when you're recruiting and hiring making new hires, how often does the subject of post-employment benefits come up as an incentive or as part of an overall package, an employment package for any level of position in the city? Probably greater for those at the senior leadership levels, but I mean, is this part of a recruitment package that when you're looking to fill spots on city staff?
Thank you for that question. I think when you hit the nail on the head, that those that are more senior in their career, regardless if it's the senior leadership team or not, those that are have become aware of and are more engaged in what retirement will look like for them, which typically happens later in one's career. I think this is a selling point for them. It adds to our entire benefit package, which is, I think, a very generous package for us and allows us to be competitive. Those fresh out of college or just starting a career, we spend a lot of time trying to educate them about retirement benefits in general and saving early. So it may not have clicked for them just yet, but certainly I think those of us who are a little more senior in our career appreciate understanding those kind of benefits and what's available to us after retirement. And I do think the city, compared to where other places I've been, we have a really generous program. I know there were some tweaks made, which we've discussed, but even with those tweaks, I think it's still a very attractive program and selling point for us.
So it puts us in a better position to compete for talent.
I think so, right? And depending on the field, some people are a little more in the weeds than others with some of the details. But you can pick up a newspaper or not recently, it's all dominated with COVID, but you wouldn't be hard pressed to find a community that does not have their retirement benefits funded or their pension plans are inadequately funded. And I do think some people pay attention to that as well. And we won't have to say that, right? And so for us, it may not necessarily be about credit ratings, because that's not a business that we're in. We're not in the debt business, but we are a community that I think is very fiscally responsible and tries to be responsible with our liabilities, which this would be one.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm done. Appreciate the answers.
All right, we'll go to Rob.
Thanks, Mayor, and thank you, Tom and Kim, for this. Question, what is the vesting period for our OPEB for?
Let me see.
I don't know if I know that offhand.
I think I believe
Bill.
there's a combination of age plus years of service equals 75 is what don't quote me, Councilmember Wu, but I'm pretty sure it's something formulaic in that way.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So where I'm going with that question is we.
I think Lynn knows the answer.
Yeah, like I say, as someone who's closer to retirement, I do know the answer. It is age plus years of service must equal 75, but you have to have a minimum of 15 years of service.
You are nowhere close to retirement.
Yeah.
So our city is a defined contribution as opposed to a defined benefit retirement plans. And so, that lends itself kind of to portability and the movement of personnel, as Mike had mentioned. So the question that I have in thinking about OPEB as a benefit to our workforce is it an appropriate benefit? Are there other better ways that we can spend our money to attract and retain talent? And so I'm just throwing that thought out there, not necessarily as something that needs to be answered today, but more so as we think about the 21st century workforce and their mobility in particular, as to the appropriateness of certain benefits and to attract and retain talent.
I think it's a good question. I know that, and I've talked with Kim Yocklin about this, where we do benchmark our benefits against competitor cities. I don't know if, I think for us, Rob, and I'm going to say us, category, when you think about the cost of healthcare post-retirement, if you actually think about it that way and are kind of in tune with your retirement plans, this is an incredible benefit. People just, we have to maybe help sell it better or help them understand what it would mean to actually retire and achieve the benefit from the city. But it is, that is for the most part, many times the reason people can't retire because they won't be able to afford healthcare in retirement, and what they'll get through public benefits aren't going to be adequate for their situation. So I do think it's an attractive benefit. I don't believe that any of our competitors don't have this or have something in lieu of, but it is certainly something I know we look at regularly, and we can certainly take another look and benchmark that.
It is a great benefit, and it's particularly a great benefit if it vests. If it doesn't vest, then it's not really a benefit. And so, I'm thinking about this in terms of, like, for example, the Army, which has the 20 years for the retirement, so not necessarily for medical. And they've recently been relooking that because it wasn't really providing a benefit to those that don't make it 20 years in the military. And so, and primarily that's because, there's a different force out there. And so just thinking in the civilian terms, thinking about 21st century employees and benefits.
All right, thank you, Rob. So before we go to the public, I'm going to let Tanisha lead us through the second discussion, and so that anybody who'd like to comment can comment on either or both. So at this point, I'll just say thank you to Tom and to Kim for this presentation, and was really good. I learned a lot. We've been funding OPEB for a lot of years and haven't sort of broken it down in this way often. So thank you both for that. And Tanisha, I'll turn it over to you for the American Rescue Plan Act overview and the other updates.
Great. I think my part is brief. We're going to do just a high level update here, and Kim is going to stay with us. And thanks again, Tom, for being with us tonight. So,
do you need me to stay for the public, or should I?
Oh, wow. Do we think we'll get questions for Tom from the public?
We don't. No, you don't have to stay. If we get any questions for Tom, we can relay them to you and get them in writing.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, thank you very much, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks.
Thank
Tom.
you.
Take care.
All right. Great. So as we all know, the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, provided $1.9 trillion in economic stimulus and relief, including $350 billion of direct aid to states and local governments. Of that $350, $130 billion is the local portion. So as I've mentioned before, cities have been divided into two groups with two different funding formulas: metro cities, which are cities with populations of 50,000 or greater, and non-entitlement communities, which are cities and towns less than 50,000 in population. The non-entitlement communities aid will flow through the states, and then they will be funded on a per capita basis. I think those numbers for the states were just released tonight, and so I think in the next few days we'll learn more about what non-entitlement communities will receive. But Gaithersburg is considered a metro city because we are greater than 50,000. And our funding is based on a modified formula for CDBG, or Community Development Block Grant funding. So we are going to be receiving a total of $11,500,277, half of which has already transferred to us as of last week, and the second half will be released in May of 2022. Treasury released the interim rule on May 10th, and this is expected to be rolling guidance as clarifications and further interpretations are released as we go forward. The interim rule is about 150 pages, but I just want to summarize the main points, which of course, most importantly, how can the funds be spent? So essentially there are four broad buckets of eligible use to respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency or its negative economic impacts. That can be in the form of direct aid to businesses, residents, organizations to mitigate the negative economic impacts of COVID-19. So the second bucket is to provide premium pay for eligible workers. The third is to provide for government services to the extent of the loss of revenue. And the fourth is to invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So each bucket comes with its own strings, more definitions and interpretations of what this all means. It's a non-exhaustive list attached to each. The hard guardrails is that you cannot use, well, local governments, it actually hasn't been clarified for, states can't use the funds to promulgate a tax decrease or a tax cut, and funds can't be directly deposited into pensions. So those are sort of the hard guardrails, but there's a world of flexibility for each bucket. The most flexible of all the buckets is the government services, so the loss of revenue category, and there is a formula that attaches to that that cities can use to determine what that amount would be. And I say that that's the most flexible because the other ones come with time constraints. So there's a time frame in which the dollars must be spent. They have different reporting constraints as well and requirements. And in some cases, while it's not mandatory, things like alleviating the negative economic impact of COVID-19 For example, if you use that in a census tract that is already deemed eligible through HUD, the reporting requirements are a little less onerous, or you can try to come up with your own rules to establish why aid needs to be given to that particular person, organization, business, etc. And then the time constraints also tied to that. If we apply the loss of revenue formula and determine what that amount is, essentially those dollars go in as revenue to our current budget. So this current year, we've received half, as I mentioned last week. In FY21, we could count that as revenue for the year. And then we have flexibility to spend those dollars on government services. And that is whatever we deem to be government services. So that third bucket, I think, is the most flexible. And the finance staff took a quick crack at applying the formula to determine how much revenue loss we would be able to claim. So to give you some context, we got 5.7 million in this first half, and about 5.5 of that, according to the formula, could be used as revenue loss. What I'm doing with that and how I feel about that, I think is important to explain that. One, we're convening internally a work group that will be taking a look at how do we leverage these dollars best for our long-term recovery and resiliency. So it's not just depositing the money into the city's account and we walk away, but looking creatively and strategically across the board, both as an organization and community, and how we might invest those funds within the rules, obviously, for this long-term recovery and resiliency. So we'll be looking at that internally. There will be no impact for the budget process at this moment. So I want to mention that as we move into your final adoption next month, or not next Monday, but 2 Monday nights from now. There won't be any impact to the budget because one, half of the funds are showing up in fiscal year 21 and they will show up as revenue. And if we decide to program those funds in any way for spending in FY22, we will come back to you for a budget amendment. Between myself and the finance staff and Tom Lonergan and a couple of his staff members, we've probably participated in 5 or 6 webinars each as the guidance from Treasury continues to unfold and try to make sense of the rules. I think each new clarification usually comes with 3 or 4 new questions, whether it's a reporting question or a timing question, or in some cases they hadn't anticipated certain hurdles that we would need to tackle in order to meet the guidance. And so I think, one, I'd like to say that Treasury has been extremely responsive and engaged. They've been working hand in hand with organizations like NLC, GFOA, ICMA, NACO, to make sure that we're getting direct response and have direct access to some of these questions that come up. And then there are other questions we're waiting, and I think we'll be waiting a while for a response, like the transparent calculations for each city, right? That question has been asked. How do we get to this 11,500,277? What is the formula? They have not yet revealed the formula to us, but we hope maybe that will come out. I think they're focused on, Treasury's focus was getting the dollars out the door in time to meet the statute's requirements, and then to come up with these rules to help cities and counties know how they can spend the dollars. So between Kim and I think we can try to answer some of your initial questions, but I want you to know that we'll be coming back to you intermittently over the next couple of months with reports out from the working group and where we'd like to head with some of the spending. And right now, I think our plan is to rely on bucket 3 to give us the most flexibility in how we can spend those monies. For example, Mayor Ashman asked me earlier, can these dollars be spent on capital projects? outright, no, it cannot be spent. But if we count it as loss of revenue and it goes into the city's coffers as such, it can be used to provide for government services, which could include capital projects and infrastructure. So we're trying to make sure we understand that guidance very closely as we work through our ideas and our strategies to leverage the funds. And then finally, I'll just say that I will continue to beat the drum with our partners, particularly the county and the other local entities that will be receiving dollars within the county. We all should find a way to work together to make sure that we're leveraging the dollars. The county's getting $207 million. A big chunk of that is going toward revenue loss for them as well, but there's a huge portion of that that is unallocated at this point, and they are looking at the same thing. They're looking at ways to strengthen and fortify the community, and we should make sure, if we can, we should try not to duplicate efforts and instead look for ways to leverage the dollars that are flowing into our county. So I will continue to work on that front as well, and hopefully have some positive news to share in the coming weeks. So I'm going to pause there on ARPA and see if there are any ARPA questions.
So thank you, Tanisha. So right now, so we have 5.7 million that's come in now. And then you say, based on the estimates with finance, about half of that can be, we can attribute half that amount to revenue loss from
5.5 million. Sorry.
5.5. Okay.
Yeah. So
You
the
went kind
vast
of fast
majority.
there. I was trying to jot down notes, but
I'm
5.5.
sorry. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, I like the idea of the work group to come up with some recommendations for the council to consider. I saw Neil's hand first, and then Rob's. We'll go to Neil.
So the first question is, does the 5.5 million that can count as revenue loss include last fiscal year as well as the current fiscal year 20, as well as 21? Because COVID started before the current fiscal year.
That's an excellent question. The interim rules require that we perform the calculation at certain places in time. And so the first look back is calendar year 20. So we're required to look at the calendar 20 against fiscal year 19, which is not quite the way we're used to doing things and thinking about it, but the interim rules are very specific in that respect with how we are supposed to perform that calculation. So the next time that we will evaluate revenue loss, it will be for calendar year 21. And that's part of the reason why we're really not able to even try to tackle a revenue loss estimate for FY22, because it will be calendar year 21 and we're not even halfway through yet. So that's an excellent question. And to add to that, the guidance also provides a growth factor. So you would look at fiscal year 19, you would include a growth factor and then calculate the revenue loss.
All right, so what I was wondering was, does the 5.5 million of revenue loss that out of the current bucket constitute most of what we're expecting? And I think the answer, based on what you just said, is no, that we have this year, which is, there will be a pretty substantial revenue loss in 21 that will probably eat up a chunk of the money that we're expecting next year. Is that correct?
I think that's a safe assumption, but I think we also have to look at what the second half of 21, calendar year 21 looks like as things start to reopen and activities start to pick up.
I'm not going to hold you to it. I was just the shape of things as they appear to be at this point. Is that
I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that we'll be able to use a good chunk of that second allotment for revenue loss as well.
All right, that makes the decision-making process much more straightforward going forward. Thank you.
Yes and no, Councilman Harris, yes and no, because as I mentioned, when we claim it as revenue loss, we then also claim with that a lot of flexibility for spending. So it doesn't need to be all internal city organizational spending, which is why the work group is going to convene to, try to think strategically and creatively about it. So it makes what it does for us, there's an advantage built in that, it will encumber the vast majority of it for the most flexible use of the dollars, if that makes sense. Versus looking at spending through those other categories, which are great categories. And a lot of organizations will need to do that because they'll have a lot more left over that they need to figure out, come up with new programs and figure out ways to spend it. We get to be, I think, a bit more thoughtful. So it buys us time, it buys us opportunity to be thoughtful and strategic because we're not on a clock. I think the dollars need to be spent in some cases by 2024, in other cases 2026. We won't be on a clock, and we can really, be thoughtful about how we go forward.
So is there also a need to account for the fact that we reduced expenses against our already projected revenue loss?
No.
Oh, that was a very good answer. Thank you.
I agree. I was happy about that. It was, there are a lot of pieces that frustrate us. I think just because, as Kim said, they're different. In fact, Kim had to sign away her life for the first time ever for receiving city funds. She needed to provide her own personal information and social security number. And I don't know if you had to give a blood sample or what, Kim, but there are a lot of pieces like that are like, why did we choose this path? But on the flip side of that coin, there's tremendous flexibility for using these dollars and I'm excited about our opportunities with them.
We'll go to Rob.
Thanks, Mayor. I was having trouble with the clicky button thing. Thanks for the presentation. I appreciate the information and learning more about this going forward. Actually, my first question was in line with Neil's last question, was whether the revenue loss calculation was absolute or was it a impact where you would offset it against the expense savings. And so it sounds like this is just, if we're quantifying the financial impact to the city, that 5.5 isn't necessarily a representation of it because it's not a net number. It's an absolute number of revenue loss. Is that fair?
Yes.
I would say so.
Okay. And then the second question I had is, as with many circumstances where we live within the political subdivision structure that is Maryland, and having to fight with the county for funding that they receive on our behalf, is there any expectation of additional funding going to the county that's supposed to be for the benefit of the city that we can be expected to be coming this way? Or is the way the structural allocations were made, we were separate and apart from the county's calculation?
We are separate and apart. And I unlike the CARES Act, where the city was able to apply to the county for reimbursement of certain COVID expenses, because every single jurisdiction, large or small, is getting their own share of money out of the ARPA, I would hold my breath that the county is also going to share their dollars. Right,
well, and did their dollars count 70,000 residents of the city of Gaithersburg in the amount of their allocation? If it did, I would expect we get some of that money.
Well, I think the getting can happen in other ways, right? This is that coordination and collaboration discussion that I would love for us all to have as a big county, because they're looking for ways to invest in agencies and nonprofits and organizations that are going to be doing this work in the community. They're doing that work in our community as well, and we want to make sure that we're all not drawing silly fences around how this money gets spent. And I also don't think it makes sense for any of us to duplicate efforts. We should be second in, right? They should be first in to whatever the priority is, and we can fill in the gap because our 11 million compares as a fraction to their 207.
No, I wholeheartedly agree that the county's priorities in this funding should consider all county residents, whereas, you know, the city has an allocation where I don't think we should be spending our allocation in Silver Spring. Anyway.
Any other questions on this before we go to the budget changes? Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, so, you know, I think the Treasury set up a number of aid programs that provide direct aid, I think, to for assistance to residents, either for rental assistance or eviction prevention or mortgage delayed, you know, mortgage assistance, whether they're for people who have mortgages on multifamily properties or on a single residence. That, I mean, that should be complementary to anything that we would provide in terms of services, right? We're not going to, in terms of using part of this to provide city services, should not duplicate or replicate those other funds that are available to various sources, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
That's certainly our goal. We don't want to duplicate efforts. We want to leverage.
And so, and then also I get to get back to Rob's issue about whether or not the county should provide services or provide aid to our residents as well as non-city residents. I think it would come under, it might come under those categories of support and assistance, so that we wouldn't have to worry about our residents and our taxpayers not getting a piece of that ARPA funds. So, okay, thank you.
All right. I don't see any other hands up. So Tanisha, go ahead with the budget changes.
So the budget changes is actually really quick because you're going to get more information in your packet for the June 7th meeting. But I did want to mention, because it was noteworthy, we were projecting to use about $980,000 of reappropriation for the next fiscal year. Thankfully, we're receiving about 1.2 million. 700,000 of that is coming from either not open space grants, but bond bill. We got a bond bill and we got another grant for Pleasant View Park through the state. So that money has now been incorporated into the budget. And then we had a $500,000 reimbursement that we were expecting on the Robertson turf field to be in this current fiscal year. It's now shifting to the next fiscal year because of project delays. So the revenue will go into the next fiscal year as well. And so that wiped out our need for any reappropriation to be budgeted in this next year. On the operating side, it's a net gain of, I think a net add to the budget of about $10,000, if I'm not mistaken. So there's been a lot of little shifting here and there that you'll get a detailed report on individual line items and departments as we refine estimates for spending that netted a $10,000 increase overall to the proposed budget. So you'll get more detail next week, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention because I was pretty excited about the fact that we don't have to plan for any reappropriation in this next year.
Good news. Okay. So before we go any further in conversation, I just want to open it up. If there's anybody in the public who'd like to testify on any of the topics we've been speaking on tonight, just use the Zoom raise hand function. And if I see your hand go up, then I'll call on you. Going once, going twice. Okay, I don't see anybody. All right. Well, we don't have anybody from the public who wants, oh wait, we do. Tech team. Well, before tech team, before you bring up Cicely Davey, let me just say we ask that you keep your comments no more than 3 minutes. If you have more than 3 minutes worth of testimony to give us, just submit it. You can give us 3 minutes now and submit the rest in writing. We ask that you state your name and address or neighborhood for the record. Tech team, if you could bring up Cicely Davey, please. And Cicely, just unmute yourself, state your name and address or neighborhood, and go right ahead.
Hello, my name is Cicely Davy. I currently live in 41 Maple Hill Court, Gaithersburg, Maryland, 20877. I'm here most of the year, and I'm a college student, so I'm here for the summer. And I was curious to learn about appropriation for community development events, such as like kids clubs or getting them more engaged in the public. I know like currently social distancing measures make it so that programs are more limited, but I was more interested in like hearing about funding going to like reading programs or summer camps, that sort of thing. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Cicely. So it may be, if you're talking about in our budget in general, we do have our draft budget document available online. It's, you know, I can't quote from memory what we've put into recreation programs and our study bubbles and that sort of thing. If you're talking about with the American Rescue Plan dollars, you know, that is yet to be decided. As we're putting together this study group, this work group to provide recommendations. So Cicely, are you still on at the moment? Can you?
No.
Yeah, you are. I hear you.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yes, I am on. Yes.
Okay. So do you want to just clarify which sort of dollars you're talking about?
I recognize that we had a surplus, so like the discretionary spending that resulted from having I recognize that we're more than balanced. Like we have was the figure that I heard, like $10,000 of spending to go, and we were trying to determine that amount.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, thank you. So tech team, you can let Cicely go. So Tanisha, how do you want to explain what the $10,000 and what happens to that?
So the $10,000 is actually an add to we've increased the budget by about $10,000. Not that we created a surplus of that amount. So there is, however, because we've eliminated the subsidy that was required, there is a small surplus that will be created that will go to our reserve fund. Because we've spent the surplus down over several years to make investments, we sometimes also give back to that reserve fund so that the monies are there. Specifically, Cicely, if you want to take a look at the Parks, Recreation, and Culture budget, so the budget document is unwieldy. So if you go to the table of contents, you can look and find the Parks, Recreation, and Culture budget, and you can take a look at how they are funded. I think you might be pleased to find a lot of the programs that you raised, as whether we were funding those or not, are currently involved in the budget. And if you have more specific programming questions, you can just send me an email. I'm happy to connect you. If I know the answer myself, I will certainly respond or connect you with our staff that can give you more details on those programs.
Yeah, I would like to add, you could send that, you can copy me on the email too, because you just got sort of a very highly technical answer, a highly technical government answer to a question. And I'm not sure that's the question you were asking. If you were asking about like, what sort of programs do we have? Do we have programs for recreational programs for children? Do we have our camps and our study bubbles and our sports leagues and our youth centers and all that sort of stuff? If that's the question you're asking, then I would start at gaithersburgmd.gov, our city website, and look up the facilities and the programs that we have. But if we're not answering your question, again, my email is judd.ashman@gaithersburgmd.gov, and I'd be delighted to delve into it deeper. I'm just not entirely clear if we're speaking the same language here. So,
and just to add to that, if the question was what I think it was about our recreation spending, I can direct Cicely to page 169 of the proposed budget that shows proposed FY22 spending on sports and youth services of about 2.5 million. And that includes summer camps, recreation programs and sports, the youth center at Robertson Park, the skate park, and the youth center at Old Town.
Thank you, Kim. All right, so do we have any further questions or comments from the council on this? Not seeing any. Okay, well, Tanisha, Kim, thank you all very much for a very informative night. And we look forward to further conversations on the budget and on OPEB and on the ARP and all this good stuff. So I will remind everyone that we do not have a work session next week because it is Memorial Day next Monday. And so the next regular meeting of the Mayor and City Council will be on Monday, June 7th. And until next time, everyone, let's do great things, Gaithersburg. We are adjourned.